Okay, guys, so you are an expert at the frontal or anterior view of the skull, as well as the lateral, as well as the posterior, as well as a superior view from the top of the skull when it has the cranial cap attached to it. But now we're going to take off that cranial cap, and we are going to focus on two of the more tricky aspects of the skull. And this is before we move on to the rest of the axial skeleton, the vertebral column and the thoracic cage. But we're going to be looking at the inferior aspect of the skull. Look at that. That is one busy place there. And each of those little things, bumps, grooves, holes, they all have a name, of course. So we're going to be learning all those, as well as learning the parts of the cranial skull. So this is a superior view with the cranial cap taken off. So it's called this cranial skull. So it's important as you're studying these things to learn to recognize bones and bone parts from any angle so that you'll know exactly what it will look like no matter how you turn it. Sort of an exercise in thinking in 3D. So let's get started with the inferior skull. So I'm going to flip this guy around. I'm going to try my best to show you what I can in the camera, but it's really difficult actually, especially because everything's backwards. So when I move left, it shows up right, and it's kind of hard to get used to that. So I'll do my best, bear with me. But more importantly, once I'm done just going over this, we are going to go over AP Revealed. That is the best way to study these bone features and the parts of the skull. So let's get started. I have a trusty little screwdriver to help me point things out, but I think my fingers will probably serve well for a lot of this stuff. In all of this, disregard this screw right there. That's actually was attached to a spring to hold the jaw in place, but that is not part of the skeleton. That is a screw in this particular cast. But the rest of it are things to pay attention to. So let's get started. Well, obviously this is the anterior side, and this is the posterior side. And you remember that these are the maxillary teeth because in the frontal view, they are attached to the maxilla. So if those are the maxillary teeth attached to the maxilla, what must be these bones forming the front part of the palate, the roof of the mouth? They're maxilla bones, right? So what you're doing is you're looking at the inferior side of these huge maxilla bones that make up a large majority of the face. So those are the maxilla. And moving posterior, the back of that palate, forming the posterior hard palate, are the bottoms of bones called palatine bones, and we mentioned those. So palatine bones are L-shaped bones. And so the kind of the long part, the vertical part of the L, is a process called the orbital process that you can see a little tiny bit sticking out in the orbital. But the rest of it's running through the middle of the face, and then the bottom of the L, right here, is what's forming that posterior hard palate. So there's actually two bones, and they're fused, so there's a little suture between them. Don't worry, I won't make you know the name of that suture. But following that backwards, you can see that there's a piece of a bone here. That is your vomer bone. So let me go ahead and point that out. So that little thing right there is your vomer. So you remember that you saw the vomer is a plow-shaped bone. So it's kind of like this weird triangular-ish bone. And so remember that the vomer forms the bottom septum of the nose, but then the rest of it is visible right here in the back of the palate. And it's flanked on either side by parts of the sphenoid bone. So when in doubt, say sphenoid or ethmoid. In this case, it's sphenoid. And so between the sphenoid and the vomer, you can see these little caverns. There are two little caverns there. Let me see if I can point them out with these sticks. So a cavern there, and there's a cavern there. And so these two together are called choana. And we'll write this down. You'll see the writing of it when we get to AP Revealed. So this is just an introduction, and then we're going to practice it in AP Revealed. So the choana are separated from each other by the vomer bone in the middle and flanked by parts of the sphenoid. Now, what parts of the sphenoid are we flanked by? Well, we got a little thing here and a little thing here. Those are the medial pterygoid plates of the sphenoid bone. Medial because they're towards the middle, and oops, let me see if I can hold those there. There we go. They're towards the middle, and pterygoid. Pter means wing. So they're kind of like little wings because they're part of that butterfly, that bat that the sphenoid is. And they're plates because they're flat. And lateral to those are larger plates. So these would be the lateral pterygoid plates. So again, we have medial pterygoid plate. See if you can get that in the thing. Medial pterygoid plate, lateral pterygoid plate. Choana, vomer, another choana, another medial pterygoid plate, another lateral pterygoid plate. So again, the lateral and medial pterygoid plates are part of the sphenoid bone. So moving on, that means that all of this is part of the sphenoid bone as well. In fact, what we're looking at is the greater wing of the sphenoid. And if I stick my finger through here under the zygomatic arch and go laterally, you'll remember that we had identified that piece of the greater wing of the sphenoid right there. So it just comes out here. So the sphenoid is actually covering all this area here. Sphenoid is a big, huge keystone bone, right? That is a huge bone. All right, let's see, what else do we got here? Well, let's keep moving on down. Notice here we have a big hole. Big hole. See, big hole. That big hole we've already identified, I think, before, but I'll say it again. It's a big hole, and therefore it is called the foramen magnum, because foramen magnum means big hole. So that's the foramen magnum. It's the big hole, and that is where the brainstem and the spinal cord meet each other. So the brain stem would obviously come from inside the skull, and then the spinal cord would come out from out there. Now this is really interesting. Look at these features here. There's a bump right here. Can you see that? And a bump right here. Those bumps, remember we have already learned the term condyle. So a condyle is kind of a rounded bump. And these are also condyles, and they're part of this whole bone, which is the occipital bone. So you saw the occipital bone from the posterior side, and there's your little external occipital tuberance right there. Well, it wraps around, so all this is occipital bone with the foramen magnum running through it, and the foramen magnum is flanked by these occipital condyles. Now, why are those occipital condyles important? They are very important because it turns out it's thanks to these little bumps that we can move our head up and down, up and down, up and down, because these occipital condyles articulate, meet up with the superior articular facets of the atlas bone, C1, your first cervical vertebrae. And they just kind of rock along, allowing your head to move up and down. Very important little thing. So we'll address those again when we start looking at the atlas vertebrate. Now, what else do we got here? Okay, well, some parts you'll already recognize from our previous discussion. Here's a styloid process right here. So you know your styloid process. Here it is on the other side, styloid process. Remember, that's a point of attachment for 3 different muscles, all starting with stylo. And posterior to that, you know what this is, mastoid process. So that's the mastoid process. Now remember that anterior to your styloid process is a nice little indentation there, and on this side, remember we already talked about that. That is your mandibular fossa. So your mandibular fossa articulates with the head of the condylar process of the mandible, and that allows your jaw to go up and down. Okay, easy enough, right? Those aren't so bad. There's a couple other things we could have pointed out in the posterior view, and we didn't. And this cast doesn't show these very well, but a real skull would. There are some ridges through here called neutral ridges. There are superior and inferior neutral ridges, and those are ligament attachment sites, but I won't spend too much time on those because you can't really see them in this particular skull. We'll look at them on AP Revealed. But now we get into the fun part of the inferior skull, and that is all the holes. So you already know the foramen magnum. What about these other foramina? Little itty bitty things. They all have a name, and we're going to learn them all. Now, one of the best ways to study these little holes, besides AP Revealed, is to make yourself a map and some mnemonic devices, because it gets a little confusing. I mean, look, there are a ton of holes there to learn. let's see what we can do. Let's start with the biggest one next to the foramen magnum. We already know that one. But look at this one. So I'm going to stick my screwdriver through here. See that? And on this side, we got one over here. Notice how they're nice and oval shaped. So these are your foramen ovale, or foramina ovale. Singular would be foramen ovale. So that means oval hole. Foramen ovale. So look with my finger here. Can you see that? Out there in cyberspace, you see that nice big oval shaped hole? Foramen ovale, O-V-A-L-E. And I'll write that down for you, or it will be written for you in AP Revealed. Now go right posterior to that foramen ovale, and right there by my finger, can you see that little tiny hole right behind it? That is called foramen spinosum. Very interesting, because you've ran into the word spinosum before when we were talking about epithelial skin cells. Remember the stratum spinosum meant spiny strand, spiny layer. So right there, that little tiny hole behind the foramen ovale is the foramen spinosum. Now, let's keep going. Here's another rather large hole right there. So notice that kind of flanks where the occipital bone starts, right there. That's part of the sphenoid bone. And on the other side, so all these are on both sides. 1, 2, let me see if I can hold this like this. Make a darker background for you. Okay. Let me use this. So here's one, and here's the other. Okay. So those are, notice how they're kind of jagged around the edges, like they were lacerated. Those are foramen lacerum, or foramina lacerum for plural. Foramen lacerum, foramen ovale, and then the little one right under that, foramen spinosum. So I can't get my stick really on the spinosum, but you get it, the one right behind there. Okay, so we got ovale, spinosum, lacerum. Okay, what else do we got here? Moving on down. Okay, so now as you move down, you start to see two kind of largish holes getting close to the foramen magnum. One is really large. See that big thing? I can go joo with that. And right above it is a slightly more round, smaller hole. Well, this is where your jugular vein goes through. So this is the jugular foramen. And the one right above it, you might have guessed, is your carotid canal. So the internal carotid artery goes through the carotid canal, and the jugular vein, or the jugular vein goes through the jugular foramen. And then there's another hole right behind the styloid process, and that's the stylomastoid foramen. Makes sense because it's right by the styloid process. And what else do we got here? That's pretty much it. Of course, a little ways around to the edge, you'll be back to your external acoustic meatus, because this is all temporal bone right here. And that's temporal bone over there. Okay, so let's do it one more time, if you can see what I'm doing here. So we got foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, foramen lacerum, jugular foramen, carotid canal, stylomastoid foramen, and there's another one that's a little bit hard to see in the camera, but right under that occipital condyle. You see that guy? That little hole right there. Right there. Right there. See him right under that condyle? That's your hypoglossal. So that is where your hypoglossal nerve, number 12, cranial nerve number 12, that feeds the tongue, is going to go through there. And there's one on the other side. Okay, so, and of course, what else do we got here? Well, this is obviously your zygomatic bone up here. And this is your temporal process of your zygomatic bone. This is your zygomatic process of your temporal bone. Here's your temporal bone. We already said the sphenoid's over there. This is your occipital, and you can see maybe a little bit of the parietal up here. But anyway, those are the main things to know for the inferior skull, another thing you might want to note is you can actually see this. So all of this is your inferior orbital fissure. So when you turn back to your orbit, you can see it's right there. All right. Okay, so we'll go back over this in AP Revealed. Here we go. So here we are at our inferior aspect of the skull in AP Revealed. So notice the muscle attachment points. I mean, look at this. Tons of muscles originating from the inferior skull. And some insertion of muscles towards the posterior part of the inferior skull. So lots of stuff going on there. Lots of stuff going on there. So let's go ahead and turn on our tags and see how you do. What was this? You guys know that. That's the foramen magnum. You're like, duh, right? Okay, so that's where the brainstem and the spinal cord meet. You remember, oh, did I go over this? I think I might have missed this one. So you know that these teeth up here are your incisor teeth, right? Those are your incisor teeth. These are your incisor teeth. Well, there's a little hole-ish depression right behind them. It's a hole, so you might think it's a foramen, but it actually has kind of like a groove going down into it, and that makes it a fossa. So this is your incisive fossa. So that's your incisive fossa. You already know these are your maxilla bones, and making up the posterior hard palate, your palatine bones. And the palatine bones with the sphenoid create these choana right here. So there's the outline of the choana, and they're divided from each other by the vomer bone. So you remember that. And they are flanked by the medial pterygoid process, or medial pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. And that is flanked by the lateral pterygoid plate of the sphenoid bone. So if we look all of this, this is what part of the sphenoid bone you can see from the inferior aspect. And of course, you guys know this, so that's your temporal process of your zygomatic bone, your zygomatic process of your temporal bone, and etc. So there's your whole zygomatic bone, there's your whole zygomatic arch. So all of those are visible from the inferior view. Okay, and obviously there's your little external occipital protuberance right there. And there's a little bit of the parietal bones you can see. And there's the mounts of the temporal bone. So you can actually see a lot of the temporal bone from the inferior view. And here's your whole occipital bone. So it goes all the way up to here. Pretty cool, huh? It's like solving a jigsaw puzzle, right? You're like, yeah, great. Okay, so now we get to the fun part. Let's go over these foramina. So let's see if you can figure out where is the foramen ovale. Remember, there's one on each side. Well, if you said this one, you are correct. So notice they've stuck a peg through here and a peg through here. So those are your foramen ovale, which means right behind there, that's right, your foramen spinosum. So let's click that.
Foramen spinosum.
There you go. Potato, potato. So that's your foramen spinosum. And moving on either side of this part of the occipital bone, it's kind of lacerated looking, so that is your foramen lacerum. And moving on back, now we get the big things. So remember, there's a circular one anterior to it, and then kind of this longish one. So this would be your jugular foramen, and notice it's a big hole, so they stuck a big peg in it. That's your jugular foramen, and right above that is the carotid canal that the internal carotid artery goes through. Now, here are your occipital condyles, which means right sticking next to them is your hypoglossal canal. So the hypoglossal canal is where the hypoglossal nerve goes through. Boy, I think we're getting it. And then over here, remember we said that's your stylomastoid foramen because it's right behind your styloid process. And your mastoid process is over here. And you know what? I think we're getting it. Okay, we said temporal bone. Anything else here we need? Oh, well, and there is the mandibular fossa that we already talked about. That mandibular fossa over here. So that is the inferior skull. So let me just go through these one more time. So mandibular fossa, mastoid process, carotid canal, styloid processes, you already know those, stylomastoid foramen, temporal bone, zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And those are just some of them. And then, of course, we can go back to your palatines, your palatine bone. What else do we got here? Here's your maxilla with the incisive fossa right there. Let's look at the vomer. Your vomer. Let's do the, we already did the occipital bone, right? Occipital bone, occipital condyles, hypoglossal canal, foramen magnum, external occipital protuberance. Oh yeah. And the sphenoid bone and its features. The sphenoid has the foramen ovale and the foramen spinosum. The greater wing of the sphenoid bone, lateral pterygoid plate, medial pterygoid plate. And there's your whole sphenoid bone. So remember, if this sounds like it's going too fast, just remember you can pause this and rewind it and pause it and rewind it as much as you want. The beauty of online. Let's go to the temporal bone and features. Okay, we already did these, right? Stylomastoid foramen, styloid process, carotid canal, mastoid process, mandibular fossa. Yeah, we already did those, but you could always use a little more, right? And zygomatic bone and its features. So there's your temporal process of your zygomatic bone, and there's your whole zygomatic bone. So there are many ways to study this. You know, you can quiz yourself in many different ways. The point is just do it over and over again, and if you can get in the lab and actually get the bones and manipulate them, having that hand touch with it will really, really help you guys. Okay, so that's the inferior skull. Now we're going to flip it over. So I'm going to go back to my little video here. That's our experts on the inferior skull. So now we're going to look at the cranial cavity from a superior angle here. And the cranial cavity can be divided into three main regions. So we have our anterior cranial fossa, which is basically all of this right here. Okay, all that. Your middle cranial fossa, which includes my favorite little part there, the sola turcica, and your posterior cranial cavity. So you can see it's formed by your frontal bone, your temporal bones, and your parietal bones, and your occipital bone. That's what's making up that cavity, along with the sphenoid bone. So you can see a lot of the sphenoid bone. It basically makes up most of the middle cranial fossa there. As well as the ethmoid bone up here. So kind of two features to note on it. And of course you can see your ethmoid bone making up part of the medial wall of your orbit, as well as the upper part of your nasal cavity. But over here, what we're looking at on the sides, which is kind of a lot of spongy bone. I don't know if you can get a good look at that. Those two sides there, that's called your cribiform plate. And in the middle is kind of this sort of nice flat area here. That is called the crista galli. And the crista galli is very important because part of the dura, the outside covering of your brain, actually attaches there. So it's kind of attaching your brain to your skull. Very important. Of course, all of the cranium touches brain. So that's all part of the anterior cranial fossa. And if we look at this part here, so this is still part of the sphenoid right here. This is the lesser wing of the sphenoid. Kind of comes down, looks kind of evil. And you have the anterior clinoid processes forming the tips of the lesser wing. Now, moving on down, all this is the body of the sphenoid. And this right here, this whole structure is my favorite structure to study, called the sella turcica, Turkish saddle. So the Turkish saddle, sella turcica, and it has this beautiful little dip, the saddle, in there. And the inside part of that saddle is called the hypophyseal fossa. But this has such an important function. This little thing is what houses your pituitary gland. It protects your body's pituitary gland. That's such an important gland. It produces so many hormones that you need to maintain homeostasis in your body. You don't want that baby getting messed up. So you need a nice bony little protective house for it, and that's the sella turcica. So the inside is the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica, and up here the edges are the dorsum sellae. So it's kind of like the backs of the seat, I think is what that actually literally translates to, if I'm not mistaken. Now, this is very interesting. Right underneath that lesser wing, look, it's holes, and holes over here. Those are your optic canals, and I don't think my screwdriver will fit through there, but if it could, you would see that it would come out the other end right in the orbit, because that's where your optic canal goes through. So that optic nerve is going right through that hole and into your brain. And I forgot to mention that the cribriform plate up here, that's part of your ethmoid, you actually have parts of the cranial nerve going through there. So cranial nerve number 1, I'm sorry, your olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve number 1. That's your nerve for smell. So amazing how all these things fit together. There's a place for everything. Now, notice under here, now we're into our middle cranial fossa. Notice you can see that nice long fissure. We all know about that long fissure. But this fissure, so remember on the inferior side we could see the inferior orbital fissure. On this side, we're actually looking at, hope you're not getting dizzy from this, you're actually looking at your superior orbital fissure. Okay, because, let's see, now I'm upside down. Eek, eek, eek. So down here, the bottom would be your inferior one, so up here at the top is your superior one. So you can see that from the superior view of the cranial cavity. So that is your superior orbital fissure under there. Eek, there we go, superior orbital fissure. You guys see that? Anyway, you'll see it on AP Revealed if you can't see it here. So hard to get the angles right in the camera. Eek, eek, superior orbital fissure. Now, this is interesting. Right behind that superior orbital fissure is another hole. And in this case, with this cast, we could not see this hole all the way through to the inferior side, but under a real skull, you would be able to. That is the foramen rotundum. See how round it is? And here it is on the other side. Foramen rotundum. Okay, so that's the foramen rotundum. So you have superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, and the rest of it, you know this. You can figure it out from what you know of the inferior side. What is that right there? Foramen ovale, right? Foramen ovale, which means right behind it, foramen spinosum, right there. Foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, which would make, moving medially, foramen lacerum. And what else do we got on here? Oh, then we come down here. Oh, you know what that is. That's your jugular foramen. But what is this up here? Go a little north. Boop. That is not the carotid canal. It's cooler than the carotid canal. That is your internal acoustic meatus. Right there, internal acoustic meatus. So you already know about your external acoustic meatus, your ear hole. This is your internal acoustic meatus. Internal acoustic meatus, jugular foramen, and in this particular cast, you can't really see the carotid canal very well. And then over here, that is your hypoglossal canal, because it's right next to where the occipital condyles are on the other side. And, you know, those are the main things you need to know on here. So the rest of it, you know, this is all posterior cranial fossa, and you know your foramen magnum. This is all occipital bone. Now, there's lots of grooves here, and all these grooves have a name. You got enough to learn. Don't worry about the grooves. But lots of stuff there to study. That'll keep you busy for a while. So let's play with AP Revealed for this, and we will call it quits on the skull. So let's see what we got here. So lots of pegs here. Again, some of these are grooves that you won't need to know. But let's start it off. What bone is that? Obviously, that is your frontal bone. And here is your ethmoid bone. So right there is your cribriform plate of your ethmoid bone. Again, your cranial nerve number 1, your olfactory nerve, goes through there. Right in the middle is the crista galli, also of the ethmoid bone, and that is a site of attachment for what's called the falx cerebri. It's part of the dura of your brain, around your brain. Okay, so there's your whole ethmoid bone that you can see from the cranial cavity. And what else do we got here? I think we went through all those. Here is the entire anterior cranial fossa. So you can see that it includes part of the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, as well as the frontal bone and that part of the ethmoid bone there. Moving on down. So we said that this is your lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, and this is your whole sphenoid bone right here. So this is what you can see of your sphenoid bone from the cranial perspective. Now, going back to your lesser wing, the very tip of the lesser wing is called the anterior clinoid process.
Anterior clinoid process.
And all of this makes up the body of the sphenoid bone there. Now, remember that there's a little hole right under that lesser wing, and that is your optic canal, where your optic nerve is going to go through. Very important nerve. You couldn't see without it. And then all of this is your sella turcica, with the very middle depression part being your hypophyseal fossa. Hypophyseal fossa. The whole thing is your sella turcica. Again, it houses your pituitary gland. So important. And the edges, that's your dorsum sellae, because that is the back of that Turkish saddle. And over here, little horns on those would be the posterior clinoid process. Usually whenever you have an anterior, you have a posterior. If you have lateral, you have medial. External, you'll have internal. And then we get over here, so that is your greater wing of the sphenoid that's visible from this point of view. There's a little area, that's your squamous portion of your temporal bone. So you remember that from the other side. Here it is on this side. And this whole area makes up the middle cranial fossa. Now what else can we say here? There is your whole temporal bone that's visible from the cranial cavity. Here, of course, is your foramen magnum. You knew that. Now let's see if we can identify all the little foramina here. Let's see, what do we got? Well, there's your superior orbital fissure, which makes this your foramen rotundum. So superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum. Again, we couldn't see that from our cast on the inferior side, but we could see it from the cranial cavity. But of course, it goes all the way through. And this right here is your foramen spinosum, meaning the one right anterior to it is your foramen ovale. So foramen ovale, foramen spinosum. So let's draw a map here. Superior orbital fissure, foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, foramen spinosum, which makes this one right flanking the start of the occipital bone is your foramen lacerum. Now we're down near the opening to the foramen magnum right here. So let's keep moving down. These are grooves. That's a groove. So don't worry about that. But here, right above where your occipital bone is, and your occipital condyle, there's your hypoglossal canal that we could see through the other side. And there is your jugular foramen. And this right here is your internal acoustic meatus. So not the carotid canal, internal acoustic meatus. So keep that in mind. Now, moving on down, now we're in the occipital bone. And again, all of these things here are little grooves. Groove, 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 fossa, which are your cerebellar fossa, where your cerebellum fits. And this is all of this is your posterior cranial fossa. Okay, so play around with AP Reveal. There's a reason why I made that a required software for this course, because you should play with it. It'll be great for learning these things, but also don't forget to pick up and play with the bones in the lab, because those will help you out as well. Booyah! You guys did it! You finished the skull. Good job! That is actually the hardest part, in my opinion, of learning the skeletal system. Once you got the parts of the skull down with all its little holes and nooks and crannies, you are ready for the rest of the skeleton. The rest really isn't bad. So we have one more little mini lecture here to share on the axial skeleton. That is to go over our vertebral column and the thoracic cage. And then we'll do the appendicular skeleton. And then last but not least, joints. All right, great job, guys. I hope you're having fun. Take care.